When 3 women vanish without a trace, investigators comb for clues and find themselves on the trail of a savvy serial killer. Without witnesses, detectives are at a total loss to find a missing woman. To solve this case requires an act of God. When a woman disappears from under her own roof, investigators suspect that she was murdered. But getting to the bottom of it will require some sophisticated technology. Most murder investigations begin with a body. But when the body is missing, detectives face the ultimate challenge: catching a killer when the victim is presumed dead.
Tips hotline.
It was a Monday, June 19th, 1989, when police in the Kansas City suburb of Overland Park, Kansas, received a call from worried parents. Their daughter, 24-year-old Joan Butler, hadn't shown up for work that morning. She hadn't even phoned in. No one had seen her since early the day before.
That's interesting because...
Though she had been gone just over 24 hours, her parents were convinced something terrible must have happened to prevent her from contacting anyone.
And in the town that he grew up in,
Police agreed to check on her.
that's a small town.
When investigators searched Joan's apartment with one of her friends, they found no sign of her. And according to Detective Pat Hinkle, no sign that she planned on being away.
No bags had been packed. Her makeup was still around the sink. No clothing appeared to have been removed from the apartment, so the only thing missing was Joan.
They learned that Joan had spent Saturday night with her girlfriends.
Yeah, they're great.
At 4 a.m. Sunday, she went home.
I love you. That explains it. Thanks again. I'll call you tomorrow.
That was the last time they saw her. Joan Butler wasn't the kind of person to leave without a word. She saw her parents at least once a week and socialized often with her friends. She wouldn't miss work without good reason. In her apartment, her friend pointed out to police the clothes Joan was last seen wearing, so she had definitely made it home. But her purse, wallet, and her car were missing. By roll call Tuesday morning, the mystery had deepened. A check of Butler's bank account revealed that $300, the daily maximum, had been withdrawn from an ATM at 6 a.m. Sunday, just 2 hours after she was last seen. It happened again early Monday and early Tuesday. All the ATMs were in the Kansas City area. None had video cameras. The pattern suggested that someone else was in control of Joan Butler's account, and maybe in control of Joan.
He had gone down and played, I don't know if you remember.
Her family and friends posted leaflets all over Kansas City, describing Joan and her car and pleading for help to find her. Her disappearance made the news, but turned up no leads. Until 1 week later. On June 25th, police got their first tip.
Sir, can I speak to you
Joan's
for a minute?
car had been spotted outside an apartment complex 40 miles from her home. The man with Joan's keys told the officer that he borrowed them from his buddy inside. The officer suggested they go in and sort things out. The suspect began to escort the officer inside, then took off. He caught the policeman by surprise and made an agile escape. The officer learned that the fugitive was a painting contractor named Ricky Cho, and the men were his crew. They also told him that Cho recently started driving a new red car, Joan Butler's car. When police examined the trunk, they discovered part of the carpet had been cut away. They also found a dark stain. They presumed it was Joan Butler's blood. According to Detective Hinkle, if that were the case, it would prove that she hadn't left of her own free will.
Any experienced officer would then suspect that possibly the trunk had been used for the storage of the person who belonged to the car, the missing person.
Investigators couldn't be certain it was Joan's blood without having a sample from her to compare it to. They hoped a new forensic technique called reverse paternity could help them. It works on the theory that a person's DNA shares the same traits as the DNA of her parents. By taking a close look at both parents' DNA, investigators could estimate what their children's DNA might look like. Blood samples would have to be taken from Butler's mother and father. Then the DNA from the blood found in Joan Butler's car would be extracted and compared. The meticulous process would take weeks.
Unicorn.
While awaiting analysis of the stain, detectives ran a background check on Ricky Cho. The name turned out to be an alias, one of many. His real name was Richard Grissom. He was a 28-year-old ex-con with a rap sheet almost as old as he was.
Utility to Heather Keaton of Shawnee.
His criminal background included a history of forgery, a history of auto theft, and a prior conviction of homicide in which he killed an elderly woman in the city of Leavenworth, Kansas.
He was charged as a juvenile in that crime and served only a few years before he was back on the street. Grissom's father was African American and his mother was Asian, giving him a striking combination of features that allowed him to drastically alter his appearance. Throughout a decade of crime and disguise, he had evaded capture. Police worked the equation: a young woman's sudden disappearance, a drained bank account, and a stolen car. Factor in a convicted killer named Richard Grissom, and the result pointed to kidnapping, possibly murder. If Joan Butler wasn't dead yet, investigators feared she soon would be. Police fanned out across Kansas City, interviewing friends and colleagues of Grissom, but no one admitted seeing him. After Joan Butler's bank account was emptied, her trail evaporated too. Investigators had no more leads. Then, on Monday, June 26th, David Roosh received a message that his daughter Christine was sick and wouldn't be coming into his optical lab where she worked. Later that day, Roosh went to her home to check on her. She wasn't there. Neither was her roommate, Teresa Brown, who had also called in sick. Christine's car was gone. Neither woman had checked into a hospital, and none of their friends had seen them. the women seemed to have simply vanished.
Good, Dave.
The next day, their families filed missing persons reports.
Hey, you're
gotta
here.
go out and you got to.
Both women were well liked, with close families and friends.
Might go out tonight? Don't think so.
Christine, age 22, enjoyed working at her dad's shop. Teresa, also 22, had saved enough money to enroll in college. Neither woman had any problems to speak of, and neither was the kind to shirk her responsibilities. Their behavior, like the mess in their home, was out of character. Detectives combed the apartment for clues. Their wallets were missing, but oddly, a curling iron was left on. It was all very disturbing, especially so soon after the disappearance of Joan Butler. Detectives collected hairs and fibers, including 2 dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding that didn't seem to belong to either woman. No blood was found in the apartment, no weapon, no sign of forced entry or struggle. In short, no evidence of a crime. The front door hadn't been forced. If there had been an intruder, it was either someone the women knew or someone with a key. It wasn't much of a case to hand District Attorney Paul Morrison.
We didn't have a crime scene here. What we had was a lot of different fragments, and so our task was to try to see what we could put together from that and build a scenario and piece together what we think happened.
Detectives learned that passkeys had been given to a painting company, Richard Grissom's painting company. What began as a missing persons case now looked like a spree of kidnappings. The day after police searched Christine and Teresa's apartment, Christine's abandoned car was found a few hundred yards from her home. On the driver's side fender were fresh flecks of blue paint, but inside they found no viable clues. Later, a check of the roommate's bank records showed another sinister parallel with Joan Butler. Their accounts were quickly drained through multiple transactions. But if investigators hoped to link Richard Grissom to the missing women, they'd need solid proof. It surfaced in the lab when the dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding were analyzed. The hairs proved to be of African Asian origin, like the suspect. That wasn't the only link. From Grissom's employees, police learned that he had rented a storage locker for his business. Detectives obtained a search warrant to have a look. Inside, they collected some hairs. And outside, a potentially bigger clue, a 6-foot length of duct tape, wadded up and embedded with hair.
About every 8 inches, there was a large number of long human hairs, and then a space, and then long human hairs, as if the tape had been used as a gag, had been wrapped around the mouth of someone.
Investigators hoped this was what they needed to link Grissom to the victims. They compared the hairs on the tape to those gathered from the missing women's hairbrushes. But the sun had bleached the hair found on the roof, making a definitive comparison impossible. That, along with the gag, suggested she had been held there against her will. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why was there no sign of her roommate, Teresa Brown, or of Joan Butler? Where were the women now? While investigators pondered these questions, the case progressed on another front. The results from the testing of the bloodstain found in Joan Butler's trunk had come back from the lab. The DNA in the sample closely matched DNA from her parents. Physical evidence now linked Grissom to 2 of the 3 victims. Their whereabouts and Grissom's remained a mystery. As police searched for Richard Grissom, their hunt led them from Kansas City to Grandview, Missouri, 22 miles away. Grissom's own car was found abandoned in a parking lot. It was taken to the police impound lot, where detectives spent 5 hours processing the incriminating contents. They found false IDs and stolen credit cards, some belonging to Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown. Police also found keys to their apartment, to the home of Joan Butler, and dozens of others. Family members were brought in to identify the items. The evidence connecting the criminal to his victims was now more than circumstantial. But so far, it was moot. Richard Grissom was even now on the lam, and police were no closer to catching him. Christine Roosh's father identified 3 rings belonging to his daughter. But still, no sign of Christine. 3 days into the investigation, hopes of finding the women alive were fading. As police continued to dig, they learned through an informant that on the very day that Roosh and Brown disappeared, Grissom had rented a second storage locker in the Kansas City suburb of Stanley. He stopped using it just 3 days later. The manager told police a young woman had paid for the unit, but she filled out the application under the direction of a man. The manager couldn't positively identify Grissom's picture. She recalled that the woman seemed distressed, like she needed help. She signed her name Roosh. Yet the woman the manager identified in the photo was Teresa Brown. There seemed no reason for Teresa to impersonate Christine, unless she had no choice. Detectives searched the locker, but found no signs of violence or other leads. Then, on their way out, they spotted something familiar: blue paint.
This storage facility had a computerized gate access where you have to drive up, punch in a series of codes, your PIN, if you will, and then it would allow you entry into the storage facility. The poles were set rather close to the touchpad, and it was apparent that several cars had run into these poles in the past.
The paint was similar to the paint found on Christine's car. Police took chips from the poles and the vehicle and sent them to the Johnson County Crime Lab, where forensic examiner Gary Dirks analyzed them.
The question paint chip displayed no differences when compared against known paint that was removed from a blue concrete pole beside the storage shed that Richard Grissom rented.
The blue chip helped police paint a picture of what might have happened in the storage shed.
Our belief of the coming and goings from this storage facility was that that's where he was hiding out. That's where he was hiding from the police, and that's where he most likely was hiding Christine Roosh and very possibly Teresa Brown.
As Kansas City police continued their search for 3 missing women, a final clue turned up on the other side of town, courtesy of an 18-year-old Good Samaritan. He was on his way home from work when he spotted something on the roadside. It seemed someone had lost their valuables: a checkbook, credit cards, receipts, and other papers. The young man decided to contact the owner. Her name was Christine Roosh. Police found 4 checks unaccounted for in the ledger. They were traced and recovered. On the morning of Monday, June 26th, the day Christine called in sick, she cashed them at the drive-up windows of 4 branches of her bank. Within an hour, her account was emptied of $2,400. None of the transactions were filmed, but police believed Grissom was with Christine.
You can look at her checks as she signs them that morning. Clearly, Christine Roosh, very steady, legible handwriting. With each check, the signature degrades more and more and more to the point that the last one, you almost can't read it. And you can only imagine, Christine sitting in the front seat of a car, knowing that what her fate might be.
At 10 p.m. that same day, Christine drove to an ATM in Belton, Missouri, and cleaned out the bank account of her friend, Teresa Brown. Police believed by this point Grissom had already killed Teresa, and Christine was next. These are the last photos taken of Christine alive.
Local media.
Kansas City police were desperate to capture the elusive Richard Grissom.
Sheet of construction paper and called it the many
Then
faces
they got a
Richard.
break. Grissom slipped up and told friends where he was heading. They informed the police, who apprehended him in Texas and brought him back to Kansas.
You grow up in there?
Leavenworth. Well,
The police still had no bodies, but they had a long chain of evidence leading to Richard Grissom. Besides the stolen jewelry and emptied bank accounts, they amassed a wealth of forensic evidence: bloodstains, paint flakes, and hair samples.
Each forensic piece of evidence by itself probably did not make or break the case, but the consistent thing about all those small pieces of evidence were that they all pointed directly at Richard Grissom as being the perpetrator of these crimes.
On November 4th, 1990, Richard Grissom was convicted of kidnapping, robbery, theft, fraud, and murder. He's serving multiple life sentences in the Kansas State Prison. Grissom never explained what happened back in Kansas City, but police have their own theories. Grissom had keys to the apartment of Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown, so getting in was no problem for him. He'd also done work in Joan Butler's apartment complex and obtained a key for her unit as well. To this day, the whereabouts of the missing women remains a mystery, closely guarded by Richard Grissom.
I think Grissom is a true power freak, and I believe that this is his last act of defiance, that he was able to get over on the police, be able to prove that he is superior in some manner, because the investigators have never been able to find the bodies, and I think that's his last card.
A determined, experienced killer can tax a police department's resources, but so can a killer who acts on impulse. Elizabeth, New Jersey is an industrial town and a residential suburb of New York City. Like any city, it has its share of crime, and its police force is trained to handle whatever might come up, through deadly force or shrewd detective work. Once a criminal is in their sights, they don't give up. Shortly after 6 a.m. on Wednesday, August 5th, 1992, a mechanic arrived for work at his auto shop. He spotted a car parked out front that didn't belong there. He found out the owner was Karen Sherrier. He phoned her to pick up her car, but her parents said she wasn't home. They hadn't heard from her in 2 days. Her family was alarmed to learn that Karen hadn't shown up for work, that her car had been abandoned. Her sister reported her missing, Detective Christopher Kenny was assigned to the case.
The family was definitely concerned right from the beginning. It was unlike her to not call anybody or contact anybody over a period of time. She has a lot of friends located here in Elizabeth. Her family was down ashore, and she would be in touch with someone. At this time, she hadn't called anyone or spoke to anyone.
From the family, police learned that Karen had gone out for a night on the town 2 days before. One of the bars she stopped in was right across the street from where her car was found. On the same day that Karen Sherrier was reported missing, police launched a search to pick up her trail. It led 3 blocks away to the City of Elizabeth Recreation Pier along the Elizabeth River. There, a police dog picked up Karen's scent going onto the pier. And then the trail went cold. The search for Karen Sherrier took New Jersey detectives back to the last place she was seen, the bar across the street from where her car was parked. The owner and one of his customers recalled seeing Karen early on the morning of Tuesday, August 4th. She was with a man named Joseph Zabita. Detectives called Zabita in for questioning after learning that he had been paroled from prison just a few months before. According to Detective Kenny, at this point, he seemed a likely suspect.
The criminal history showed that he had been arrested numerous times in the past, and that he had also been arrested for a rape and had spent time in prison for a rape.
Zabita admitted being with Sherrier the night she vanished. He explained they went bar hopping on Monday the 3rd, and early on the morning of the 4th wound up at a tavern on Front Street. He said Sherrier was giving him a ride home when they passed a man she knew. She stopped, Zabita got out, the other man got in. That, Zabita said, was the last time he saw Karen. He said he didn't know the other man's name or where they were going. During the interview, detectives noticed a crescent-shaped bruise on Zabita's arm. He explained he had caught it in the tailgate of a pickup truck. He allowed the detectives to take photographs for the record.
Once we were done interviewing him and talking to him that evening, we had to let him go because we had no evidence to hold him.
Still, detectives didn't buy Zabita's story. The bruise on his arm looked a lot like a bite mark. To be sure, they sent the photographs to forensic dental consultant Haskell Askin.
I did determine upon looking at the photographs that this was, in my opinion, a human bite mark, and it was a matter of finding the teeth to match up with this bite mark.
If Karen Sherrier made that mark, it would prove that more went on than Zabita admitted. But to match the teeth that made the mark, investigators still had to find Sherrier. The next day, they were back on the waterfront. This time, they brought along an officer from the New Jersey State Police Missing Persons Unit. Again, the search was futile. With no word from Karen Sherrier and no reason for her to disappear on her own, investigators had to assume she was dead. Detective Kenny had no motive, no evidence, no body, and no case. Still, he kept his suspect in his sights. Zabita was the last person seen with Karen Sherrier.
We would call Mr. Zabita in, we would speak to him, talk to him again. He stayed to his story, basically, and we spent about 3 months just trying to find Karen Sherrier's body.
Police had tried everything, from interviewing witnesses to tracking with bloodhounds, and had come up empty. The victim's family applied pressure to keep looking.
Karen Sherrier's family and friends came to us and they requested that we do a search. They wanted to do a search. They felt like they wanted to do something to try to find her. They told us they would go out, they would make up flyers, they would get volunteers.
Investigators agreed to one more search. But then, Mother Nature intervened. The worst storm in a century walloped the New Jersey coast, churning up the entire Elizabeth River waterfront. Once the flooding subsided, Sherrier's family insisted that the search proceed. Some 30 police officers, firefighters, and civilians combed the banks of the Elizabeth River, not far from where Karen's car had been found. But the odds of finding anything now seemed astronomical. They searched all day without turning up anything. Then, near the railroad bridge, a searcher noticed something in the weeds a few feet from the water's edge. He'd found a human skull. It was apparently washed up by the storm, then left behind as the waters receded. It was an amazing find, but was it the remains of Karen Sherrier? The teeth would provide proof positive, except that every last one of them was missing. The search for Karen Sherrier turned up a skull in the Elizabeth River, but without the teeth, the first solid clue seemed utterly useless. Investigators brought Haskell Askin back on the case to apply his expertise. His first finding was unsettling.
Examination of the skull suggested to me that the teeth had been forcibly or traumatically removed from the skull.
Even though the teeth were missing, Askin found distinguishing traits in the skull. The shape of the sockets where the teeth had been, the shape of the roots, and a distinctively shaped bone along the sinuses. Askin then compared his findings to skull x-rays taken by Sherrier's dentist. There was no doubt in Askin's mind. The skull was Karen Sherrier's. Armed with these findings, detectives returned to the Zabita household and served an arrest warrant on Joseph Zabita. Down at the station, he revised his story.
We explained to him what we believe happened. We told him what evidence we did have. After talking with Joe Zabita for a little bit of time, Joe Zabita admitted to us that he did, in fact, kill Karen Sherrier.
As before, Zabita said they left the tavern in the victim's car. By now, they had spent several hours together, and he had slowly won Sherrier's trust. Then, he betrayed it. They drove to an access road down by the Elizabeth River. There, he ordered her to stop the car. They began to fight, and Zabita hit Karen in the face. He couldn't recall how many times.
He struck her. Once he struck her, she wasn't moving. He was nervous, worried.
Zabita left her there. Then he parked her car across from the auto body shop and walked home.
What happened there?
Zabita never explained why he cut off the victim's head. Police speculate that Zabita, worried after being questioned about the crime, returned to the scene and tried to destroy the victim's physical identification. In our legal system, a confession may not guarantee a conviction. Cases are won on the merits of the evidence. Without the victim's teeth, investigators couldn't prove she made the bite mark on Zabita's arm. They had nothing to definitively link the suspect to her. So they asked Zabita to show them where he dumped the body. Police divers never found the remains. Detectives built their case on what they had. Eyewitnesses who saw Zabita with the victim on her last night alive, and the x-rays of the victim's skull. Joseph Zabita pled guilty to aggravated manslaughter and was sentenced to life in prison. He won't be eligible for parole for 25 years. Investigators traced Karen Sherrier's murder to a chance meeting with a sinister stranger. Detectives in South Portland, Maine, had far less to go on. On August 16, 1991, police were called to the home of William and Pearl Bruns. Pearl's daughter, Elaine, was worried because she hadn't heard from her mother in 3 days.
So when was the last time you spoke with your mother?
Pearl never went far from home and always phoned her. Detective Linda Barker spoke with Elaine.
The daughter was very adamant that her mother always called her at least once or twice during the week.
She calls me like 2-3 times a week. I haven't heard from her in a couple of days now.
Inside, the first thing the detective noticed was droplets of dried blood starting in the kitchen sink and trailing through the house.
I saw drops of blood at the sink. I saw drops of blood as you go into the bathroom and in the bathroom sink. Indeed, there was a lot of drops of blood in various places throughout the home.
Elaine explained that her mother was a hemophiliac and bled easily when cut. Pearl had cut herself in the kitchen on the day Elaine last saw her and had rushed to the bathroom to dress the wound.
Want to show you the rest of the house? Sure.
Along the way, she must have left a trail. Aside from the disconcerting bloodstains, most of the Bruns' home was neat and orderly, but the bedroom was a shambles.
Yeah, I don't know where she would have been going, but this is not the way she passed.
It looked as though Pearl was interrupted while packing to leave.
Oh, look, there's some more blood.
On the suitcase were more drops of blood.
Like I said, even a small cut. Well, I mean, it's unusual just that, she...
On the bookcase, Elaine noticed something that upset her more than the blood.
Well, she never took
her
this
mother's
ring off.
friendship
This is
ring.
From her best friend. She got it 14 years ago, and it's never.
Elaine explained that Pearl never went anywhere without it.
And you just now found that?
Yes.
She also said that Pearl had not taken her car. Pearl loved her Cadillac, and it was still sitting in the garage. And she said there was no way her mother would leave without her beloved Cadillac.
The Cadillac might have been the only beloved thing in the home. After 5 years, the Bruns' marriage had soured. Elaine said when she last saw Pearl, she was depressed. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her husband complained of Pearl's spending. Pearl had told Elaine, "I'd be better off dead." She wondered if Pearl might have done something rash. There was no sign of her anywhere in the house. The one place the Portland police hadn't looked was a place Pearl rarely ventured: the cellar. They didn't find her, but they found more blood. It was red, not brown, so it looked fresh.
You do agree this does look like it's blood?
With Pearl nowhere to be found, the logical person to question was her husband, William. He was a truck driver who was out on the road.
Hi, this is Ron.
When he returned, William Bruns recapped his last day with Pearl. After Elaine left, he said, an argument broke out over the same old thing: money. Around 6 that evening, he left the house. He said he went to a donut shop, ran some errands, then stopped for dinner. When he got home, Pearl wasn't there. She didn't return, and he never gave it another thought.
It became very apparent that she didn't just leave, and he just didn't care. And I have a photograph right here.
Barker launched an exhaustive investigation into the whereabouts of Pearl Bruns. She questioned neighbors. She visited Pearl's old haunts. No one had seen Pearl since she'd been reported missing. Next, Barker phoned taxi services, bus depots, and airlines. Every call was a dead end. If Pearl had left town, it seemed she'd gone on her own 2 feet, or hadn't really left at all. With no sign of Pearl, the detective returned to speak with William Bruns. A casual remark turned into a potential clue.
I said, "Gee, Bill, you've had your carpet cleaned." And he goes, "Oh, no, I haven't cleaned it at all." And I said, "Well, then you've replaced it. I mean, this is like brand new rug. I mean, that's how clean it was." And he said, "No, I haven't cleaned it and I haven't replaced it."
But a check with neighbors revealed that he had rented a commercial carpet cleaner a few days earlier.
Really bad stain, but
Why he would cover up such a trivial matter made investigators only more suspicious. By now, 2 months had passed since Pearl Bruns had dropped out of sight. No one had seen her or heard from her. The police suspected she wasn't simply missing, but murdered. They'd handled the case as a homicide. They used cadaver dogs to continue their search. They combed rivers and woods and other places where a body would likely be concealed. None turned up. Their main suspect was William Bruns, who still seemed unconcerned about his wife's disappearance. Bruns drove his refrigerated delivery truck throughout New England and into Canada. If he were the killer, he could have disposed of his wife anywhere. A check of the truck revealed it had been scrubbed clean. No traces of blood were found. In Maine, homicide investigations are conducted by the state police. Sergeant Mike Harriman was assigned to the case. Harriman began with the Brunses' home, if only to rule it out.
We wanted to better search the home and the surrounding areas to see if possibly Pearl's remains were within the home, in the basement, or in the surrounding area, possibly buried in a shallow grave.
On November 17th, investigators paid another visit to William Bruns. This time, they brought a cadaver dog to search the woods around the house. The search was another dead end. In the cellar, the dog detected something. Yet when police dug, they found nothing.
It likely will be.
While the search was proceeding, Harriman interviewed William Bruns. Suddenly, the normally stoic Bruns seemed shaken.
all right.
He broke down and started crying, and we thought, well, maybe we're going to begin to hear something here. And then he just reiterated, "I wouldn't hurt my Pearlie."
Now that the case had moved from missing persons to homicide, the detectives analyzed the dark brown stains found all over the Bruns home. Maybe not all of it was Pearl's. Perhaps it wasn't even blood. They didn't want to overlook any detail. At the State Crime Lab, forensics expert Ron Kaufman ran 2 tests. The first simple test would determine if the stains were actually blood. It proved positive. The second test would determine if the blood was human. He used an enzyme that reacts to human blood proteins. It reacted, proving the blood was human. But the lab couldn't determine if the blood was Pearl's.
We had no record of Mrs. Bruns' blood type. So eventually, we sent samples of the blood that we found on the suitcase, along with a blood sample from her daughter and the biological father of that daughter, to a private DNA laboratory, where they conducted what they call reverse paternity testing on the samples.
The reverse paternity test yielded a match. The blood came from Pearl Bruns. The blood evidence gave the state police enough evidence for a warrant. They returned to Bruns's home and began looking for more blood, enough to indicate foul play. This time, they sprayed the entire house with luminol, a chemical that makes even the faintest residue of blood glow in the dark. Detectives were astounded by the results.
And the whole area lit up bright green, the whole carpet, the wall. It was quite incredible. You could actually even see footsteps where someone had walked through the blood. And you could also see where someone had cleaned the carpet. You could see the motions back and forth where someone had attempted to clean it. And indeed had cleaned it by the naked eye, but the luminol could pick up the blood.
Detectives submitted the stains to the forensics lab. As they feared, it was Pearl's blood in fatal amounts. Detectives concluded that William Bruns had lied about more than cleaning his carpet. But to prove murder, they needed the body. Police believed that Pearl Bruns was murdered in her home, but they weren't at all certain they'd find the body there. Cadaver dogs couldn't pinpoint anything. Sergeant Mike Harriman knew they needed more drastic measures.
We had either the choice of removing the house from the foundation and digging that cellar with a backhoe, or finding an alternative means, which was ground-penetrating radar, to thoroughly scan that basement to see if there was a disturbance in that soil.
Ground-penetrating radar beams high-frequency radio waves into the earth. The reflected waves can detect anything from fuel tanks to power lines by revealing changes in the soil structure. Detectives turned to geophysicist Scott Culkin to conduct the search.
If you think of soil layers being laid down horizontally, they have a certain structure. And if that structure is compromised by a shovel, a backhoe, somebody digging, the soil structure, again, is destroyed.
If anyone had dug in the Bruns' cellar, GPR would reveal it. On the morning of September 11th, detectives returned with another warrant. The GPR made pass after pass across the dirt floor.
We have one depression.
About 90 minutes into the survey, the GPR detected an anomaly, a spot where the soil was disturbed.
We informed the Maine State Police of the presence of an anomalous area, and that anomalous area was approximately 5 feet by 18 inches wide, suggesting the presence of some sort of burial pit.
Something was down there. The digging began. After 5 minutes, police uncovered an oblong object wrapped in plastic and bound with a rope. It was a human body. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. On one arm, they found a wristwatch with a name engraved, Pearl Bruns. The examination showed the victim had been struck hard across the face. It was more than her frail body could bear.
She had a broken orbit of her eye, she had a broken cheekbone, broken nasal cannula. Pearl bled to death. If she had been given first aid or a rescue had been called to that home that day, she would have survived the injuries.
Confronted with the evidence, William Bruns pled guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years. Bruns never explained why he let his wife bleed to death without calling for help. Police know the couple was arguing, perhaps over Pearl's spending. The half-packed suitcase implied she was threatening to walk out. What is certain is the case assembled against William Bruns.
The forensics in this case was extremely important. I had done a considerable amount of legwork over the past year, and yet didn't have the tools that the state police actually had. The cadaver sniffing dog, the luminol, the access to the ground penetrating radar. All these tools made the discovery of Pearl's body possible. Without that, we could literally still be looking for her.
Time was, police had to produce a body to prove a murder. No more. Now, murder can be proven when the victim is merely presumed dead. "7 years after a woman vanishes, a trail of evidence leads investigators to an isolated boat ramp on the Missouri River. They must pull proof of her murder from the murky river. In a rural Virginia county, a skull and a piece of jewelry are the only clues police have to identify a victim. But will it be enough to catch a killer? A woman is missing for weeks. When her body is discovered, the police must piece together their case from a few torn shreds of tape. When someone disappears, it's difficult for police to prove murder without a body. But today, forensic science can find justice for a victim months and sometimes even years after they have gone missing. Maryville, Missouri is a small Midwestern town. But in 1990, it was caught in the grip of a big city problem. To combat a growing methamphetamine industry, investigators sought help from those on the inside. Christine Elkins had been arrested for selling the drug. In exchange for immunity, Christine cooperated with authorities by helping to build a case against her supplier. She agreed to tape their next meeting with a microcassette recorder concealed in her clothing. On July 26, 1990, under the watchful eyes of investigators, Elkins met with the distributor at his house.
You got the stuff?
From the moment she walked in, Tony Emery, her dealer, was suspicious.
What are you doing?
He grabbed Christine and searched her.
I don't know what you're talking about. No, you are.
He threatened to kill her if she ever betrayed him.
When you cool off, okay?
Agent Mike Schmitz headed up the case for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
She came back afterwards extremely upset, stating that he knew that I was wired. He attempted to locate the recorder. She was extremely upset.
Christine told agents that she was afraid for her safety. They urged her to stay away from Tony. When agents tried to listen to the tape, it was indecipherable. The case against Tony Emery would have to be made on informant testimony. A few weeks before Christine was scheduled to testify against him, police received a call from her mother. She hadn't heard from her daughter in several days, and she was worried. A search of Christine's house indicated no sign of a struggle. Her car, a maroon Oldsmobile, was gone. Missouri State Police worked with the ATF on the Emery narcotics case. Investigator Larry Bodenhammer.
Well, the investigation changed after her disappearance because After a period of time, it was like, well, where is she? You know, what has happened to her? Has she left on her own accord, or has something happened to her?
Investigators interviewed Christine's friends and acquaintances. One friend told police she'd seen her around 10 o'clock the night she disappeared. Christine had asked her to watch her son for a few minutes while she met someone. Christine made a chilling prediction as she left. If she wasn't back in a few minutes, she'd be in the morgue. No one had seen her since.
All right, I need to bring everybody up to date.
The ATF and the police now suspected that Tony Emery was behind her disappearance. He had a strong motive, but without evidence of an actual crime, authorities could not prove his involvement. 3 weeks later, Maryville police received a tip from a federal drug enforcement agent in Colorado.
Sergeant Strong.
A methamphetamine manufacturer facing time in federal prison wanted to make a deal. He claimed he knew about the murder of a female informant in Maryville. Investigators feared he was referring to Christine Elkins. Maryville police and ATF agents flew to Colorado to question James Witt. He told them he manufactured methamphetamine for Tony Emery and his cousin Herb Emery. He said he'd heard the two men talking about killing an informant in Missouri. In exchange for leniency, Witt agreed to meet Herb Emery and wear a wire. Authorities hoped their conversation would provide details of the alleged murder and possibly lead them to Christine Elkins. 3 months after Christine's disappearance, Witt met Herb Emery in a restaurant parking lot. Agents listened to their conversation from a car nearby. Witt pretended he needed to get rid of a body and asked for advice. Herb Emery told him the best way to dispose of a body was to put it in the trunk of a car and sink it in a rock quarry. It was investigators' first clue. Using detailed maps, they identified rock quarries deep enough to conceal a car. But the Midwest, famous for its native limestone, had literally hundreds of quarries. To narrow their search further, they had to think like a killer.
If you've got a person in the trunk of the car, what would you do? Would you drive a long ways when it wasn't your car? You could break down. If you were to find a rock quarry, it would have to be something close. It would have to be something that you didn't have to drive. It's a very wet season. You wouldn't have to drive through a field because you might get stuck.
They focused on a 75-mile radius, but that still left hundreds of possibilities. Over the next several months, investigators systematically searched those rock quarries for a car containing a body. They found nothing. The ATF, the Missouri State Police, and Maryville Police considered the Emerys dangerous, but lacked sufficient evidence to support a murder charge. Setting up a task force, investigators devised a strategy to get them off the street until they could prove murder. Federal agents again used James Witt, this time to set up a methamphetamine buy. Herb and Tony Emery met Witt at a prearranged location. Agents observed as Tony Emery gave Witt $20,000 for several pounds of the drug.
ATF, on the floor!
They moved in to make the arrest.
Don't move. Get on the floor right now.
In the summer of 1991, Herb and Tony Emery were convicted of conspiracy to keep and sell methamphetamine. They were sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary. With the Emerys in prison, authorities were able to focus on the disappearance and possible homicide of Christine Elkins. According to Maryville police investigator Randy Strong, Tony Emery was a dangerous man to cross.
The community had a great fear of Tony Emery. If we had a witness to him doing a crime, they simply wouldn't come forward, or they would back out of the case. No one wanted to talk about it because they were afraid of what he might do to them.
But with the Emery cousins safely behind bars, authorities hoped their associates would no longer be afraid to talk. And they had a lead. In their taped conversations, Herb Emery had told James Witt about a third man who was present the night of the murder.
ATF, we're looking for Bobby Miller.
Bobby Miller was a friend of Herb's in Colorado. But when investigators tried to question Miller, they got nowhere. Even from prison, the Emerys cast a frightening shadow. Investigators went to one of the Emery's rental properties mentioned in a monitored conversation between Herb Emery and James Witt. They suspected that this was the site where Christine had been murdered. The woman who answered the door confirmed that she rented the house from the Emerys. Once inside, investigators were dismayed to find the house had been gutted and remodeled. If Christine had been murdered on the premises, all evidence of the crime had been destroyed. Out of options, the investigators re-examined their case files, looking for a clue, something they might have missed the first time, that would link the Emerys to Christine's murder. Investigators found phone records linking Bobby Miller to Herb Emery around the time Christine disappeared. They also learned that Bobby Miller had rented a truck near Maryville the night Christine was last seen. It suggested his involvement, but they had to find a way to get him to talk.
Yeah, this is pretty creepy.
In September 1996, 6 years after Christine's disappearance, police went back to Miller.
Okay, Bobby, you know why
They
you're
offered
here
him
today.
immunity in exchange for his testimony.
And your attorney has given us
On the
permission
advice
to
of his
give your
attorney,
statement.
Miller took the deal.
You really pin all this down?
Miller admitted he was outside Herb Emery's rental property the night Christine Elkins disappeared. He said he watched her go inside, where Herb and Tony waited. When he heard screams, he panicked and drove off. Investigators believed they knew what happened next. But without a body, making a murder case against the Emerys would be difficult, if not impossible. 7 years had passed since Christine Elkins' disappearance. The ATF and the Maryville, Missouri police had Bobby Miller's account of her murder, but no evidence to back it up. And they were running out of time. The suspects in her disappearance, Tony and Herb Emery, were about to be paroled from prison. Determined to prevent their release, authorities scrutinized every facet of their case. They decided to take a closer look at the Emerys' associates. Dana Kleiser wasn't directly involved with Emery or his drug ring. In fact, investigators interviewed him only because Tony had once dated his sister. According to Kleiser, Tony Emery arrived at his rural home the night Christine disappeared. He asked to borrow some gas, then asked Kleiser to show him a nearby boat ramp. Wary of Emery's reputation, Kleiser didn't ask any questions, but led him to a boat ramp on the Missouri River. Tony told him to wait several miles away. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Investigators now believed they knew the location of the car containing Christine's body.
We now realized that we had to try, at least plan, to recover a body out of the Missouri River. And I think the thing that was going through both of our minds was the Great Flood of 1993. And I know I was thinking that, unfortunately, Christine is probably in the Gulf someplace now after that flood.
The currents of the Missouri River are normally powerful enough to move something the size of a car great distances. During the 1993 floods, the river became a raging torrent that overflowed its banks and caused millions of dollars in damage. It was yet another long shot, but it was all investigators had to go on. To make a case against the Emorys, they had to find Christine's car. They enlisted the help of a non-profit organization called NecroSearch International. These Colorado-based scientists helped law enforcement around the world find clandestine graves and hidden evidence. When Clark Davenport, a forensic geophysicist with NecroSearch, arrived at the boat ramp, he'd already amassed a wealth of data.
Prior to coming out to take magnetic measurements, we looked at the make and model of the car, talked to the manufacturer to determine the mass of metal in the motor. We also looked at the currents in the river bottom conditions, river speed, the floods that happened since the car had gone into the river, and the float time from the manufacturer, how long they figured a car would float.
Armed with that information, NecroSearch scientists spent 2 days searching a 6-mile area adjacent to the boat ramp. They used a magnetometer, a torpedo-shaped device that measures changes in magnetic fields. Floating several feet below the river's surface, it takes readings every 2 seconds and recognizes large masses such as a car. Used in conjunction with global positioning satellites, the magnetometer enabled NecroSearch scientists to precisely pinpoint 5 locations where abnormal masses, or anomalies, were present on the riverbed.
I felt pretty confident that the anomalies were consistent with what I would expect from a car of that size.
The next day, investigators returned to the boat ramp with a team of divers. Fighting the murky river's current, the divers searched the 5 areas Davenport pinpointed as likely locations for the car. Within hours, one of the divers surfaced holding up a Missouri license plate. Against all odds, investigators had finally found Christine Elkins' car.
This was an incredible moment. It was kind of like Excalibur coming up out of the lake with the sword. You know, it's just amazing. Just the emotion that was involved in that. We knew that we were getting closer now. We were going to put closure on this case.
Divers attached steel cables to the car and pulled it from the water. It was sent to a Maryville garage for processing. Inside, forensic examiners discovered a piece of wood wedged between the driver's seat and the accelerator. In the trunk, they found bones wrapped in carpet padding. Using hospital x-rays, the medical examiner confirmed that they had finally found the remains of Christine Elkins. The autopsy revealed a large hole in the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Christine had apparently been beaten to death. Investigators had the physical evidence they needed to charge the Emorys with murder. They believed Tony found out Christine was going to testify against him and offered her money to disappear. She was too terrified to turn him down. But when she went to the house that night, the Emorys had other plans. Once inside, Tony and Herb attacked Christine. Tony dealt the lethal blow, striking her in the head with a heavy flashlight. Her body was wrapped in carpet padding, put in the trunk of her car, and driven to the boat ramp. There, Tony rigged the accelerator and sent the car down the ramp into the river. Herb Emery pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Tony Emery was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Maryville, authorities knew the name of the victim and suspected killers, but struggled for 7 years to find her body. In a rural Virginia county, investigators had to identify a body before the search for a murderer could even begin. Amelia County is a sprawling community, located in the rolling hills of western Virginia. It's a neighborly area with a low crime rate. Not the place for murder. In 1990, while hunting for deer, a man made a gruesome discovery. On an embankment near a small creek, he found a human skull. He took it to the Amelia County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Jimmy Weaver examined the skull. Its condition told him it had been outside for some time. The presence of a long reddish hair, as well as the skull's small size and features, suggested that the victim was probably female. 2 opposing holes in the skull were consistent with entry and exit wounds made by a single bullet. Sheriff Weaver and his deputy went out to the scene.
On my way in, I was trying to think of who it could be. There was no one in Amelia missing. No one had called me. Amelia is a small, close county. If something happens, we know right away.
After securing the area, Weaver conducted a thorough search. They found more bones, jewelry, part of a blanket, and a piece of denim. Concerned that animals might have scattered additional clues, the investigators broadened their search. They soon discovered what appeared to be an arm bone and a gold bracelet. The evidence seemed to confirm Sheriff Weaver's original theory that the victim was female. Weaver sent the evidence to the Virginia State Medical Examiner's office in Richmond for analysis. Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro examined the remains. The skull told her a great deal about the victim.
First, it showed that it was a young white female. Second, it showed that it had a gunshot wound and that there was injury related to this gunshot wound, and that the trajectory of where this bullet went in and where it fractured on the other side indicated it had a path that was lethal.
As the examination of the skeletal remains continued, the medical examiner's office was able to establish that the victim had been 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 4 inches tall, with reddish blonde hair. The description was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state of Virginia. The search was on for any missing women matching Amelia County's Jane Doe. Now, Sheriff Weaver could only hope and wait. In January 1990, the Sheriff's Department in Amelia County, Virginia, needed a lead to establish the identity of skeletal remains found in an isolated area. It wasn't long in coming. Police in Chesapeake, Virginia, reported that a woman who fit the victim's description had been missing for 8 months. Dental records confirmed the victim was 29-year-old Regina Butkowski, known to her friends as Jeannie. The same day, deputies showed Jeannie's mother the jewelry recovered from the scene. She identified it as her daughter's. Chesapeake police forwarded the Butkowski case files to Amelia County. As Weaver reviewed them, he learned the circumstances of Jeannie's disappearance. On the evening of May 6, 1989, Jeannie's roommate discovered that the front door of their house had been kicked in. Concerned, she checked the parking lot for Jeannie's car. It wasn't there. She called Jeannie's mother, who said she'd last spoken to her daughter at 10:45 the night before. One fact in the police files immediately caught Sheriff Weaver's attention: Jeannie's stormy relationship with a man named Pernell Jefferson. Jeannie had met Jefferson at a local gym. He became her personal trainer, and the two dated for several months. When Jefferson became too possessive, Jeannie tried to distance herself from him, but he refused to back off.
One of the things that he had somewhat of an obsession with was with Regina. He was not going to accept the fact that she wasn't his.
Jefferson's obsession had become frighteningly clear when he allegedly kidnapped Jeannie in March 1989. But by an amazing stroke of luck, more than 7 minutes of that struggle had been recorded on her home answering machine.
It was a very dramatic tape. No one really knew how it was recorded, but it was. And it was a situation where you would hear her telling, "No, Pernell, don't hurt me, don't do things." And it proceeded on. You could hear noise in the background. And probably one of the most dramatic things of it is that at one time you heard this tremendously deep sob from Regina.
Weaver learned that Jeannie's roommate told Jefferson about the tape and threatened to call police. He released Jeannie. She refused to press charges against him, however, out of fear he might take out his anger on someone close to her. 2 months later, Jeannie Butkowski again disappeared. Sheriff Weaver focused the investigation on Pernell Jefferson. A lead came in from Jeannie's parents. They had received a letter regarding their daughter's car from an apartment complex in Richmond, Virginia, 130 miles away from Jeannie's home. The manager of the apartments alerted them that Jeannie's car had been sitting in the parking lot for 6 months. Investigators examined her car, hoping for clues to link Jefferson to the murder. They were disappointed. During the time the car had been there, it had been subjected to the elements.
When they had the flood in Richmond, it had been submerged in the flood. So a lot of the evidentiary value from that vehicle was lost.
But a new lead was quickly established. A resident of the apartment complex told investigators that he knew a man who used to drive the car. Investigators soon learned that Jeannie's car had changed hands several times. They eventually traced it to a man named Darrell Jones, who was incarcerated in Henrico County. Jones told deputies he bought the car from a local man named Wes Green. Green was with a stranger who claimed the car belonged to his girlfriend. He'd taken it away from her and driven it up from Chesapeake because he was angry with her. Investigators suspected the stranger was Pernell Jefferson. They wanted to know more and believed Wes Green might hold the key. They just needed to find him. As evidence against Pernell Jefferson mounted, the Amelia County Sheriff's Department believed his friend, Wes Green, might know more about the murder of Jeannie Butkowski. Deputies quickly tracked Green down to an apartment complex in Richmond. When questioned, he admitted he helped Jefferson get rid of Jeannie's car. The officer persisted. Green added that Jefferson had borrowed a co-worker's car around the time Jeannie disappeared. If the car had been used to dispose of her body, it was probable that incriminating evidence had been left behind. Deputies went to the appliance rental store where Pernell Jefferson had once worked. A co-worker confirmed that on May 5th, the day Jeannie disappeared, Jefferson had borrowed his car. He didn't return the vehicle until late that night. A few days later, Jefferson went to lunch and never returned. Investigators obtained permission to search the employee's car. The search yielded incriminating results. Technicians found traces of lime, a corrosive substance that hastens decomposition. More importantly, they found a reddish blonde hair similar to the one found on Jeannie Butkowski's skull. The hair was sent to the crime lab for analysis. A comparison indicated the two hairs were consistent in texture and color. Investigators now had their first physical evidence connecting Jefferson to Jeannie Butkowski's murder. Sheriff Weaver swore out a warrant for the arrest of Pernell Jefferson on capital murder charges. Authorities traced Jefferson to Stuart, Florida, where he'd moved shortly after Jeannie's disappearance.
All right, clear left. Move. Clear.
On February 3rd, 1990, a SWAT team burst into the suspect's home to find him hiding in a closet. They quickly took him into custody.
Don't move.
5 months later, Jefferson was extradited to Amelia County to stand trial for murder. Based on the evidence, investigators pieced together the events of the night Jeannie Butkowski died. On May 5th, 1989, Pernell Jefferson and Wes Green drove from Richmond to Chesapeake and broke into Jeannie's house as she slept. Jeannie struggled with Jefferson, who dragged her outside. He forced her into her own car and sped away. Green left separately. Although investigators never learned the precise location of her murder, they suspected Jefferson stopped at a remote area as he drove back to Richmond. He initially disposed of her body just outside the city. Fearing it might be discovered there, Jefferson recruited Wes Green to help him move the body to Amelia County, where they buried it in a shallow grave. Pernell Jefferson thought he'd covered his tracks, but he underestimated Sheriff Weaver and his deputies.
He thought that he would bring her out to a rural county to where probably there was a rural law enforcement agency that wouldn't find it, or if they did, wouldn't solve it.
On March 28, 1991, Pernell Jefferson stood trial in Amelia County for killing Jeannie Butkowski. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. Wes Green was also charged and convicted for his role in Jeannie's abduction. In a murder investigation, police often discover the killer was close to the victim. But when a killer preys on a stranger, he is far more difficult to find. Nestled at the junction of two rivers, Wichita, Kansas is an all-American city with a touch of Old West charm. In this story, some of the names have been changed. On September 17, 1995, a woman phoned the Wichita police to report a missing person. She said her friend, Jody McCown, got into a maroon car on South Broadway around 1:30 the night before and hadn't returned. Most missing persons turn up within a few days, but South Broadway is a tough neighborhood plagued by drugs and prostitution. The Wichita police immediately began looking for Jody McCown. Detectives contacted Becky Sims, the woman who called in the missing persons report, hoping she could give them more information. Becky told them she was with Jody and her boyfriend, Keith Perry, the night Jody disappeared. A man drove up in a maroon car and told them he was looking for drugs. He introduced himself as Chester Higginbotham. Jody and Keith got into the car to talk to him. Becky heard the man offer Jody $200 to help him find drugs. Jody was reluctant, but Keith said they needed the money. He took $100 and got out of the car. Detective Dana Gouge recalls Becky was uneasy about the unusual circumstances of Higginbotham's request.
She was very suspicious of the situation because of the amount of money that was offered to Jody in this situation. She found it very strange. So strange that she wrote down the tag number of the car.
Investigators traced the license plate to a resident named Matthew Murphy, who lived in the nearby town of Newton. They wondered who Chester Higginbotham was and how he was connected to Murphy. They ran a background check on the two men.
I'm working on that now.
They also ran a background check on Jody's boyfriend, Keith Perry. They soon learned he had several outstanding drug warrants. During questioning, Perry confirmed Becky Sims's account of Jody's disappearance, with one major difference. He denied encouraging her to join Higginbotham in the car. Suspicious of Perry's involvement, detectives obtained a warrant to search his apartment. They didn't find anything to implicate him, but collected various items for possible DNA testing later. By now, investigators had the results from the background checks on Chester Higginbotham and Matthew Murphy. A comparison of fingerprints, photographs, and DMV records proved that Matthew Murphy and Chester Higginbotham were the same man. He had arrest records for burglary and theft going back many years under both names. In fact, there were several burglary charges pending against the Murphy alias in Kansas, as well as other states. The identity change and arrest records made Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department highly suspicious.
When we find out that Matthew Murphy is an alias for Chester Higginbotham, it's again a clue that's going to show us that he's trying to hide his background, which has to mean that if he's hiding his background, there's probably something there that's more serious than burglaries and thefts.
Police called Higginbotham, who readily admitted he picked up Jody McCown on September 16th. But he said he dropped her off later and hadn't seen her since. Despite his claim, police were anxious to question him and search his residence.
We had hopes of being able to look through his house, try to determine whether or not he may have been involved in this, and also we had hopes that we would be able to find Jody alive.
Because Higginbotham was the last person seen with Jody, investigators were able to obtain a search warrant. Whatever he was hiding, investigators hoped to find the answers in his house. Wichita and Newton, Kansas police struggled to solve the disappearance of 28-year-old Jody McCown. She was last seen with a man named Chester Higginbotham. When investigators arrived at Higginbotham's house, nobody was there. Armed with a warrant, they began searching for clues. Detective T. Walton found nothing to suggest murder.
We were picking up fibers from carpeting. We were looking at his boots and his shoes. We were looking for a body, but we did not find a body inside the house.
Investigators were pondering their next move when a car pulled up in front of the house and a couple got out. The man calmly identified himself as Matthew Murphy and asked what was happening. Investigators produced a warrant and brought them to the station for questioning.
Have a seat in that chair.
Under interrogation, Murphy admitted his real name was Chester Higginbotham.
All right, Mr. Murphy, we're here to ask you a few questions.
He claimed he assumed an alias when he and his wife were placed into the federal witness protection program. According to Higginbotham, they were both witnesses in a mob-related murder case. Higginbotham reiterated his original account, that he picked up a girl fitting Jody McCown's description on September 16th. He said she was leaving town, so he dropped her off at the bus station around midnight.
Okay, we want you now.
To detectives, his story didn't quite ring true.
His times of dropping Jody off were not consistent with the times that our bus stations were open here in Wichita, either the city buses or the trailway buses. By going in and questioning him about that, he was still insistent that that's what he did. We knew that that could not have been true.
At the investigators' request, Higginbotham agreed to submit blood, hair, and saliva samples in the event a DNA comparison was called for in the future. Detectives also spoke with his wife, Vicki. She told them she didn't know her husband's real name was Higginbotham and contradicted his assertion that they were in the witness protection program. Vicki also said her marriage was troubled and she believed her husband was seeing other women. When asked about the night Jody McCown disappeared, Vicki said she came home from work and found a note from her husband. He said he was going to pick up parts for a car he was working on at a rented garage. When he hadn't arrived home by 3 a.m., Vicki drove to the garage to look for him. She said she caught him with a girl in his car. Although her husband wouldn't let her near the vehicle, she could see a girl with brown hair in the passenger seat. When Vicki confronted her husband, he claimed he was only giving the girl a ride. Vicki told him to come home immediately and then left. She said her husband arrived at the house about 5 minutes later. Based on the contradictory information obtained from Vicki, investigators questioned Higginbotham again. When they asked him about the girl at the garage, he claimed she was a friend from a local bar. But detectives suspected it was Jody McCown. Armed with a warrant, police searched Higginbotham's rented garage. Inside the suspect's car, they found a wad of green duct tape with hair stuck in the adhesive. Investigators also collected a white button with thread, black zip ties, a roll of green duct tape, and yellow rope. Detectives now believe Chester Higginbotham had murdered Jody McCown, but they still couldn't prove it without a body. Over the course of several weeks, investigators conducted a thorough search of the area surrounding his rented garage, but they didn't find anything. Without Jody McCown's body, it appeared Chester Higginbotham might be getting away with murder. Weeks after her disappearance, Wichita police were no closer to finding Jody McCown. Though they suspected a man named Chester Higginbotham was involved in her disappearance, they had no solid proof that a crime had even been committed. On October 11th, nearly a month after Jody's disappearance, a county groundskeeper working on the outskirts of town made a grisly discovery. The decomposed body of a woman lay in a ditch by the side of the road. When investigators arrived, they believed they'd finally found Jody McCown. The victim lay face down. A sweater and various undergarments were found near the body. As they searched for clues, the scene yielded a wealth of physical evidence.
She had the black plastic zip ties on her. She had green duct tape, just like was found in the shed, wrapped completely around her head, covering her nose and mouth area. The hands and feet were bound together with yellow rope that was similar to the rope that was all in the shed.
Fingerprint analysis confirmed the victim was Jody McCown. The medical examiner performed an autopsy and collected hair and fiber evidence from the body. She removed the duct tape for further analysis. Based on her findings, the medical examiner ruled the probable cause of death was asphyxiation caused by the duct tape covering the victim's nose and mouth. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether Jody had been sexually assaulted. And there was insufficient material for DNA analysis. Detectives would have to build their case on other evidence. At the Wichita Police Department Crime Lab, evidence technician Patrick Cunningham hoped the duct tape would lead investigators to her killer. Using a solution called gentian violet, Cunningham looked for latent prints left on the tape. When the dye comes into contact with human protein residues, like those left by fingerprints, a vivid purple stain appears. When the tape from Jody McCown's body was put into the gentian violet solution, the results were disappointing.
And when we examined the back side of it, near the torn edge, there were some partial fingerprint impressions in that area, but there wasn't enough minutia for comparative purposes.
Forensic examiners had one last chance to make their case against Chester Higginbotham. At the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center in Wichita, forensic examiner Gary Miller would use fracture analysis to try to prove the duct tape from Jody's body came from the roll of tape in Higginbotham's rented garage. First, he painstakingly separated individual pieces from the tape recovered from Jody's body. Then, he analyzed the torn edges to establish the sequence in which the pieces had been torn from the roll.
Upon aligning the torn edge, we can go and see that the fractures, such as a jigsaw puzzle, fits together, but we're also able to align that the spacing between these threads are consistent, and visually we can tell from the color they are consistent.
Miller's analysis proved that the roll of duct tape collected from Higginbotham's garage had been used to bind Jody McCown. Forensic scientists also compared fibers recovered from the victim's clothing with carpet fibers taken from Higginbotham's car. Under a microscope, the texture and color of the fibers were consistent. Detectives had finally established physical links between Jody McCown and Chester Higginbotham. Scientists then compared the button and thread found at the garage with those on Jody McCown's shirt. They carefully measured the buttons, noting similarities in size, design, and material. The threads from the garage and the victim's shirt were consistent. In the end, forensic science had given detectives enough evidence to make a homicide charge stick. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the sequence of events on the night Jody was murdered. They believe Chester Higginbotham took Jody McCown to the rental garage. He overpowered her, bound her with duct tape, and killed her. He then disposed of the body in a ditch by the side of the road. Chester Higginbotham, also known as Matthew Murphy, was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. Once, time and the elements could destroy evidence linking a killer to his victim. But forensic technology has found new ways around these obstacles. Investigators can overcome impossible odds and bring justice to murder victims who were long considered missing.